What's going on, fam? Today I will be doing a highly requested reaction video to something that is called the kettlebell swing is not a hinge, it's a squat, which it goes against literally everything that has ever been said against kettlebell swings. So it sounds like some clickbait to me, but I'm not sure because I haven't seen the video yet, so I want to see what this gentleman's stance is, and we will go ahead and review it. Let's dive in, shall we?
Stop hinging your swings and start squatting your swings. I know that many of you have heard the cue. The swing is not a squat, it's a hinge.
Spoiler alert, that's because the swing is a hinge. Let's see what he has to say. I'll be quiet for now.
You want to get really dialed in with your technique and have a safe and explosive swing, you absolutely want to make sure that you're squatting in the hold. But when you say squatting to somebody, they oftentimes think vertical squatting, hence the cue, hinge, don't squat.
So really quickly, it's really important that we define, a hinge versus a squat. And in most cases, when you hear people talk about a squat, what we'll talk about in the fitness space is that thigh being parallel to the floor, or some people will say hip crease below the knee for a squat. And for a hinge, we see the hips stay above the knee when we are moving, and there's more of a forward back movement of the hips rather than up and down as in the squat.
Way back in the day, the gurus of the kettlebell community were teaching, no forward knee movement. Because they're trying to find a way to load the hips as much as possible. They've since softened that now.
So I would like to know who these gurus are who are saying no forward knee movement. And the reason I'd like to know is because there are different swing styles. So for example, there is a sport style swing where when you are going back in your backswing, you for sure have a more vertical shin angle. And then you have more of a hard style swing. In some cases with a hard style swing, you do have a little more of that forward knee movement, but there's also other things to take into consideration like anthropometric measures, like limb ratios, how long a person's torso is, things of that nature. So again here, a little bit vague. I'm still disagreeing with the stance that this is a squat and not a hinge, but let's continue onward.
But the hinge, what it looks like if someone's doing sort of like a pure hinge, and I just saw, a famous fitness guru doing a hinge just like this the other day, hence the video. It looks a lot like this. They're just here, and they're just sort of hinging like this. Right?
That is a legitimate swing style, and still I am failing to see the problem.
Heavier kettle. When you start perfecting your technique and you want to have that really crisp drive out of the hole, you want to have a really good float phase, and maybe you want to be moving heavier kettlebells, you need to start thinking about the bottom, not as a hinge, but as a squat. And here's what this looks like. When you're hinging down here, the bell's coming down, I'm going to hinge forward, and then the bottom here, the bell kind of drifts away from you, or the bell, you might even see it sort of like move away from in line with your arms.
So he's talking about two different movement faults here, neither of which have to do with a hinge. So one of the movement faults he's referring to is these arms kind of drifting away as you are going downward in your backswing. That has less to do with the hinge pattern and more to do with something known as connection. And connection is more of a timing issue. In order for me to explain this in more detail, I think it'd be wise that we step outside. But I'm going to not only explain that, I also want to explain this little deal here. They say in the way the kettlebell gets out of line with your arm. That's something known as the whip, and this also has less to do with a problem with the hinge and can either be a timing issue or a grip issue. So let's go ahead, step outside, and break this down further. So the disconnect he was referring to when it comes to forearm and hip has less to do with a hinge and more to do with a timing issue. So as the kettlebell descends from its apex, what we are ideally waiting for is for our forearm to make contact with our hips before we start our backswing here. And what this does is keep the kettlebell nice and tight, and when we maintain this contact between our forearm and our hip, which we can do in a hinge or a squat, then what will have happen is a whole lot of power from our hips, and we will also ensure that we are keeping our lower back safe. When we end up losing that connection is usually when we don't hit it in the first place, meaning that we send our hips back too early. What that looks like is as the kettlebell descends, I end up getting my hips coming back too early. Because my hips are coming back too early, my hands begin to sweep down below my knees, and this is what causes the excessive stress on the lower back, not the hinge in and of itself. Now let's talk about the kettlebell whip, which is when that kettlebell gets behind you and we end up breaking that straight line in the arm like he was talking about. And again, this doesn't actually have to do with the hinge. So when the kettlebell whips towards your rear end like this here, it's usually just a couple of issues that cause it. One of which is a timing issue, meaning that on the backswing, sometimes we don't settle long enough, and when we don't settle on the backswing long enough and we get our hips coming into our forearms too early, that causes the wrist to flex and will whip the kettlebell up behind you. Second thing, just simply not grabbing the kettlebell tightly enough. So if we end up having too loose of a grip on the kettlebell, a lot of times we just get lazy and we do this pulling thing with our fingers, and this little pulling thing with our fingers on the handle will cause that kettlebell to whip. You can see there just because I'm closing and opening my fingertips, and that is the other thing that will cause it. Not so much the actual hinge in and of itself. And to go ahead and show you what I mean here, I'll go ahead and perform a few swings that are super hingy, and neither of these things are going to happen. All right, here's my hingy swings. You can see I have my forearm contacting my hip. There's no whip behind me, but maybe it's because my kettlebell is too light. It's not. So let's try it with a 70-pound kettlebell and really exaggerate that backswing. All good. All right, so now that we've addressed that, let's continue on.
To drop in that descent phase, then you're going to go into the hinge phase. You want the bell to drop pretty low because a late hinge is a really important quality for a good swing.
This is actually what we were just talking about when it came to the connection piece.
And then as the bell gets below your belly button into that waist level, you're going to start to hinge forward. As you hinge forward, though, you're not going to continue to hinge into the hole. What you're going to do is you're going to hinge forward, and then you're going to squat into the hole, okay?
So this here is really interesting. They said you're going to squat into the hole because the position that he's in right now, in my eyes, is still a hinge based on what we were talking about at the very beginning of this video, having the hips above the knees, which they are very clearly above the knees. I think something that is really important here whenever we are talking about a movement like a kettlebell swing or any hinge pattern for that matter, is that there are different types of hinge patterns. So it really just depends on what your goal is with the movement. If you're trying to be as explosive as possible, hard style swings probably the way to go. But if you are doing something like kettlebell sport, the hinge is just going to look different. Just like if we were going to do a hinge for a Romanian deadlift, trying to target our hamstrings more specifically, was going to look different than if we're trying to do, say, a barbell clean. If we're doing a power clean off the ground, we're going to have a little more knee bend involved, but they're still ultimately both hinges.
What's going to happen is the bell and the butt are going to go down and back. Now, if you notice here, my knees traveled forwards a little bit, but it wasn't like that front squat movement that we showed you in the beginning. So it's not here and then do this. That's the bad technical aspect.
That was a really good differentiation that he just made right there when it came to having the knee path too far forward as in a front squat versus having the knees coming over the tops of the shoelaces. If you're doing something like a hard style swing, again, there's going to be some variation from person to person depending upon these anthropometric measures. But if you have your knee coming forward a little bit over the tops of your shoelaces, that is good. Too far forward and it getting too squatty is a problem. I think what he's really trying to get at here is that the knee bend is an important part of a hard style swing, assuming your body type sort of fits that particular style. But with that, there are multiple ways to swing a kettlebell correctly. He is talking about one and really advocating for the knee bend here. But again, I think this creates a lot of confusion because the term squat typically refers to our thigh being parallel to the floor, and hinge typically refers to our hips being above the knee. And I'll get into why I think that he may have chosen to talk about this here in a moment.
Try thinking of the hole as a squat and not a hinge, okay? The main cue here, the reason that we say early on in your swing journey that the swing is a hinge, not a squat, has everything to do with the type of squat they're doing. We don't want a front squatty squat, right, where you're here. We want to think bell back, butt back. You're going...
So just like there are different types of squats, there are different types of hinges. And because the hip is largely above the knee in a swing, I would argue that what we have is a more athletic style of hinge and less of a vertical shin hinge, because we can have different shin angles within a hinge. Like I mentioned previously, in RDL, we have a super vertical shin angle because we're trying to target the hamstrings more. And this is what he's referring to when he's talking about a hinge in a kettlebell swing. However, we can have a more athletic style of hinge when we are doing something like, say, a barbell clean off the ground, or in this case, a hard style kettlebell swing. Either way, here's my take on this. I believe that ultimately what he was trying to accomplish here with this title is to get people to click on the video. If you've ever tried to make content, getting views is hard. And a title like that, because so many of us coaches, like literally everybody else, ends up saying that a kettlebell is a hinge and not a squat, going against that is going to get clicks. And it did. If you look at the number of views on this video compared to any other video on the channel, this one absolutely crushed. So I got to give this guy props for a really good title. And also, he did a great job when it came to explaining his stance. But again, I think there was maybe a lot of word salad when we could have just simplified this by saying that you can have more knee bend in a hinge or less knee bend in a hinge, but we're still talking about a hinge pattern in a kettlebell swing overall. With that said, if you found this interesting and you are curious to know the differences between something like a sport style or a hard style approach to kettlebell, check out this video here, and I will see you on the next one.